Living under ancestors' shadows, blamed for racism we didn't commit. Introduction. Imagine being held responsible for a crime you never personally committed. In everyday life, this is how many people feel when they are labeled racist, solely because of historical injustices perpetrated by their ancestors or others of their race. Whether it's a white American whose family arrived long after slavery, a young Briton facing scrutiny for colonialism, or a white South African born after apartheid, many ordinary individuals struggle with inherited blame. They are often confronted with the notion that the sins of their forefathers somehow live in their blood, despite having had no hand in past wrongs. This strongly opinionated look at the issue explores how people in the US, UK, South Africa, and beyond grapple with being classed as racists for things that happened when they were not even born, and why all is not as it seems with these assumptions. Large-scale injustices like slavery, colonialism, and apartheid have undeniably left deep scars on societies. In the United States, centuries of slavery and segregation created racial inequities that still persist. In the United Kingdom, the legacy of the British Empire and colonial racism has become a topic of intense debate. In South Africa, the system of apartheid brutally divided people by race until as recently as 1994. These historical realities rightly demand acknowledgement and education. However, a contentious question arises. Should descendants or members of the same race be made to feel personally guilty or labeled as racist today because of these past events? Many say no. It's common to hear people argue, "I didn't own slaves, so why blame me?" This sentiment frequently surfaces in conversations about racism in America. experimentaltheology.blogspot.com. The idea is that drawing a hard line between now and the past absolves the current generation of responsibility. Similarly, in Britain, a significant portion of the public exhibits ambivalence toward colonial history rather than personal guilt. In one survey, about 1/3 of Britons believed former colonies were better off under the empire, theguardian.com. And the largest segment, 37%, said the British Empire is neither something to be proud nor ashamed of, signaling a neutral stance, theguardian.com. Many modern Britons thus do not internalize shame for imperialism, seeing it as distant history. In South Africa, youths dubbed the born-free generation, born after apartheid, often feel it's unfair to be burdened with the sins of apartheid. They resent being constantly blamed for apartheid, arguing that we're not fighting the apartheid battle anymore, and that the issue is frequently pressed down our throats, even though they had no role in it. ScienceDirect.com. As one South African commentator noted, he worries about South Africa's youth being blamed for apartheid sins, when those scars are not their fault. MG.co.za. Across different contexts, many people push back against the notion of collective racial guilt for historical wrongs. Yet, others contend that acknowledging history's legacy isn't about personal blame at all, but about understanding ongoing inequalities. This nuance often gets lost in translation, leaving regular folks feeling personally attacked when discussions of racism arise. All is not as it seems. Calls for racial justice are usually aimed at systems and legacies, but they can feel like accusations aimed at individuals who bear a superficial resemblance, skin color or surname, to long-dead oppressors. The result is a lot of confusion and defensiveness on all sides. Everyday life under a cloud of assumption. For those on the receiving end of inherited blame, the experience can be bewildering and hurtful. In everyday life, broad-brush accusations of racism can surface in many ways. Classroom and campus. A student might be told they have white privilege or benefit from oppression simply due to their skin color, even if they grew up in poverty or face struggles of their own. This automatic guilt by association has left some young people feeling alienated. For example, one American father objected to his child's school materials that implied all whites are privileged oppressors. He felt his family's working-class hardships were erased by such labels. Social interactions. On social media or in casual conversations, people have been called colonizer or oppressor just because of their ancestry. In one real incident, a white teenager in a youth program was physically bullied by peers of other races. When he stood up for himself, Supervisors immediately assumed he must have said something racist, simply because he was white. thought-provoking. It took multiple witnesses to prove he hadn't. He later wrote about his shock that authorities knew I was white and so I was racist by default. thought-provoking. Such experiences teach a troubling lesson. Some people will unfairly presume racism before proven, based purely on the person's racial identity. Workplace and daily encounters. In offices or public life, individuals have reported walking on eggshells, afraid that any misstatement will be seen as bigotry. A British man living in the US noted that because he is white and male and therefore privileged, he feels his own grievances are dismissed. He's expected to quietly absorb comments others make about his identity, while being told he must take others' feelings very seriously, projects seattletimes.com. In other words, his feelings don't matter because of who his group is, an experience that breeds frustration. Consider the perspective of Eric, a 35-year-old white American who vented his feelings in a Seattle Times project on race. He said, "I refuse to be blamed for things that happened more than 150 years ago just because I'm white." Most of his ancestors, he noted, arrived in the US after slavery ended, yet he feels there is automatic guilt forced on him today. Project seattletimes.com, projects.seattletimes.com. Another commenter, Tom57, described this phenomenon starkly as the new racism. The idea that assuming he is guilty or bigoted just due to his race is itself a form of prejudice. Projects seattletimes.com. These are everyday people, not public figures, who genuinely feel under attack for nothing more than being born into the wrong identity in the eyes of society. Everyday life is full of such stories, even if they don't always make headlines. A contributor to the Race Card Project, which collects personal experiences about race, shared how he grew up poor and struggled, only to find in recent years that a near-constant rhetoric claims that all white people are racist, privileged, by default. TheRaceCardProject.com. He was beaten up as a kid for being white in a mostly black neighborhood, worked multiple jobs to support his family, and never felt particularly privileged. Hearing that white people are the root of all the world's problems left him angry and disillusioned. TheRaceCardProject.com. "My life has not been easy. I have had to work hard to get where I am," he wrote, questioning why he should bear the blame and guilt for slavery or other horrors when he didn't have a single ancestor involved. TheRaceCardProject.com, TheRaceCardProject.com. His story may be just one person's experience, but it echoes a broader sentiment in many communities today. The backlash and its risks. It's not surprising that this inherited blame dynamic has triggered a backlash. Being painted with the broad brush of racist because of one's skin color or ancestors can understandably lead to resentment. People start to feel like nothing they do, no kindness, no personal belief in equality, matters in the face of stereotypes about whites or other historically dominant groups. This resentment can have its own dangerous effects. Sociologists warn that when a group feels unfairly maligned, it can breed racial resentment that makes constructive dialogue even harder. Heritage, TheRaceCardProject.com. In the United States, for instance, researchers have found that white Americans' feelings of being blamed or judged can fuel opposition to racial equity policies, a phenomenon termed racial resentment in political psychology news.berkeley.edu. In other words, if people are made to feel permanently guilty or labeled no matter what, they may shut down or even push back against the very real changes needed to address racism. Another risk is that overgeneralizing blame provides an excuse for those who truly hold prejudiced views to avoid accountability. If the term racist is flung so loosely that it encompasses everyone in a given race, it starts to lose meaning. Actual racists, those who do judge others by skin color and perpetuate hate, can hide in the crowd of the unfairly accused. Meanwhile, people who might have been allies in fighting racism could turn defensive. As one opinion writer put it, treating an entire demographic as bigots by default is counterproductive and breeds division rather than unity. Projects, seattletimes.com. The conversation shifts from, how do we address ongoing racial injustice, to stop calling me racist, I haven't done anything. which stalls progress on both understanding and reconciliation. All is not as it seems, finding a better way. Despite how it may seem in polarized debates, most people today are not cartoon villains driven by hatred. All is not as it seems when we look past the labels. The white American neighbor who bristles at being called privileged may actually support fairness and just wants recognition that he's struggled too. The young South African who says, "We're not fighting apartheid anymore." ScienceDirect.com isn't denying that apartheid was evil. She's expressing fatigue at being treated as an oppressor when she wasn't even alive then. These perspectives don't mean people want to erase history. Rather, they want to be seen as individuals, not as easy stand-ins for historical villains. Finding a better path forward starts with distinguishing acknowledgement from accusation. It's one thing to acknowledge that, say, American society still grapples with the legacy of slavery. Disparities in wealth, policing, etc. disproportionately affect Black communities as ongoing effects of that history. It's another thing entirely to accuse a random white 20-year-old today of being personally responsible for those wrongs. The first invites dialogue and solutions. Everyone can help address inequalities. The second sparks defensiveness and bitterness. Likewise, in Britain, schools can teach about colonial history and its racial injustices without telling modern British kids they are personally to blame for the sins of the empire. And in South Africa, one can recognize that apartheid's legacy of inequality persists. Unemployment and poverty still skew along racial lines, without claiming that a born-free white teenager has some inherent racial guilt. Here are a few key points to remember when navigating these issues. No one chooses their ancestors. A basic truth is that none of us get to pick the families or racial groups we're born into. To hold someone morally accountable for who they are, white, Black, or otherwise, rather than what they do, goes against the very ideal of judging a person by their character. Condemning someone solely for ancestral history is effectively a form of prejudice itself, mirroring the very injustice we seek to overcome. Individual experiences vary widely. It's a mistake to assume every member of a race shares the same life of privilege or prejudice. There are wealthy and poor, kind and cruel, advantaged and disadvantaged individuals in every group. For example, not all white Americans are living in suburban comfort. Many live in poverty, and some face other forms of bias, such as religious or class discrimination. One white Canadian recounted having to delay his education and work multiple jobs just to survive, only to be told that white privilege means his life is easy by default. TheRaceCardProject.com. Sweeping stereotypes ignore this diversity of experience. Acknowledging history is different from personal blame. We can and should teach and remember historical atrocities, slavery, genocide, colonialism, apartheid, to learn from them. However, acknowledgement should not mean that guilt is inherited like a family heirloom. As one blogger noted, no generation is an island in history. The present is the past, and the past is the present. experimentaltheology.blogspot.com, emphasizing that we are affected by our history. But being affected by the past is not the same as being guilty of the past. We all have a responsibility to address present inequalities, the lingering effects of history, but that's different from blaming someone for causes that predate them. Mutual understanding beats accusation. If someone is defensive, it might be because they feel unfairly attacked. On the other side, if someone is angry about racism, it's often because they or their community still feel the pain of it. Both perspectives need airing. Honest conversation, where a person can say, "I feel like I'm being blamed for what happened before I was born," and another can say, "I feel like my history is being ignored and its effects still hurt me," is tough but necessary. Pointing fingers isn't as productive as joining hands to solve problems. Moving forward, from guilt to responsibility. So how do we move forward when racist is such a loaded word flying around? The answer may lie in shifting from guilt to responsibility. Guilt is backward-looking and passive. It's about what you or your ancestors did or didn't do in the past. Responsibility is forward-looking and active. It's about what you choose to do now. No, you are not personally guilty for the misdeeds of ancestors. But yes, we all are responsible for what we do in our own time to make things better. This means one can acknowledge that, for instance, they have benefited from being in a historically advantaged group and therefore choose to support fairness going forward, without feeling that they are a bad person. It means we can empathize with the descendants of victims of oppression and support remedies, like tackling racial discrimination, reforming unfair systems, maybe even reparations in some form. Not because we accept personal blame, but because it's the right thing to do for our shared future. Crucially, moving forward also means letting go of the habit of instantly demonizing people because of their race. Racism will not be defeated by stereotyping another race in return. As one frustrated individual put it bluntly, constant messages that white people are the scum of the earth, that we're racist, by default, only serve to reignite old divisions, therace-card-project.com. Instead, solutions need everyone on board. Teaching history honestly, building relationships across communities, and focusing on current unfair policies will likely do far more good than name-calling ever could. Conclusion: labeling someone a racist due to the color of their skin or the deeds of their ancestors is an irony of the highest order. It is itself a form of prejudice, arising from an oversimplified narrative of oppressors versus oppressed. Of course, we must remember and learn from history's atrocities, but we must also remember that today's individuals are not carbon copies of yesterday's actors. People deserve to be seen for who they are, not reduced to symbols of a past they didn't create. In the eloquent words of one commenter, I just want the world Martin Luther King envisioned, where people are judged by the quality of their character, not their skin color. therace-card-project.com. That dream cuts both ways. It means not judging or stereotyping anyone, including members of groups that once held power. All is not as it seems in the blame game of racial relations. Many accused racists are decent people who abhor what happened in history but feel unfairly maligned. And many accusers are not out to get anyone, but are crying out for acknowledgement of pain. The challenge and opportunity before us is to break this cycle of mutual mistrust. By seeing each other as individuals and allies rather than avatars of historical conflicts, we can educate without indicting, remember the past without being trapped by it, and move toward a future where no one is judged for anything other than the content of their character.